Now we're going to focus on the topic of obedience. And this is a social influence that occurs when a person follows the orders of an authority figure, often without question. It differs from compliance, which involves changing your behavior at the request of another, and conformity, which is altering behavior just to go along with that group. Obedience is often motivated by things like fear of punishment or a desire to please that authority figure. So why do we obey? The first distinction as we move from compliance to obedience is the ask or request that is no longer just an ask or request. This creates pressure, and it generally is now received as a direct order, command, or demand. People are more likely to obey requests from people or authority figures who appear credible and competent and have power and legitimacy over them. And this is because people tend to trust authority figures and to believe that they know what's best for them. For example, people are more likely to obey a police officer than a stranger. And people with social power can use their power to persuade others to obey their request. So social power can manifest as authority, expertise, charisma, and so on. For example, a boss has social power over their employees because they can hire, fire, promote. And we've learned a lot about obedience based on historical research that has pushed many limits, to say the least. So we'll take a look at two seminal studies that were instrumental in laying the groundwork for this area of research. So the first video we will take a look at is the Milgram obedience study done in the early 1960s.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Ow! I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, there. I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering a less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
So let's summarize. Milgram did experiments in the early 1960s, and they were aimed at investigating the extent to which people would obey authority figures, even when instructed to perform actions that conflicted with their personal moral values. Participants were led to believe that they were taking part in a study on learning and memory. They were told that they would be playing a role of a teacher and that another participant, who is actually an actor, their Confederate, will be playing the role of the learner. So as a teacher, they were tasked to administer electric shocks to the learner each time that the learner made a mistake on the task. The shocks were fake, but the participants were told that they were real. And so the experimenter instructed the teachers to increase the voltage of the shocks each time the learner made a mistake. And shockingly, see what I did there? Shockingly, 65% of people obey the authority figure of a psychology professor, even if it meant hurting, injuring, or possibly killing another person with an electric shock. But why were a majority of people able to behave this way? Well, researchers have looked for particular personality traits that might be associated with high levels of obedience, but they've not found any one trait or group of traits that consistently predict who will obey and who will not in experiments similar to this study. The people who went all the way also were not necessarily more dependent or susceptible to being controlled by others. They were simply people, just like you and me, like most other people, and they were caught in a situation of obey or disobey the authority. So would you shock? Also, before I finish that, there are a few takeaways from this research. To obey is easy. It takes little effort to follow someone else's directions. As the gentleman said, who's going to take responsibility for this if something happens to that gentleman? Furthermore, when you can point the finger at someone else, it relieves some of those pressures of the outcomes. Someone in the position of authority that, is really persuasive, for instance, would be even better at convincing people to comply and obey. And when charismatic people use their skills, it's easy to see how some people can fall prey to things like cults. Now, if this intrigues you, I urge you to watch The Experimenter. It's a movie on Netflix that highlights the details of this experiment. So next, we'll take a look at another critical study of human obedience, which is the Stanford Prison Experiment.
On the first day, I said, this is not going to work. I mean, the guards felt awkward giving orders, and they'd say, okay, line up, repeat your numbers, and the prisoners would start giggling.
Hey, I don't want anybody laughing. 3, 2, 1.
And then a very interesting thing happened. Dave Eshelman, who the prisoners named John Wayne, like he's a Wild West cowboy, he begins to be more extreme.
I decided that I would become the worst, most intimidating, cruel prison guard that I could possibly be.
I see in the future that you do work when you're told. Say anything when you have to defend yourself. Say bless you, correction officer.
I was sort of fascinated myself that people were believing the act, and I was trying to see how far I could take it before somebody would say, okay, that's enough, stop.
We did have to do things like push-ups. We would have to sing things. At the beginning, we protested some of the actions. We did things to irritate the guards.
So the guards' authority was challenged right off the bat. And the guards had to decide how they were going to handle that, and they had to decide it without our input. I mean, again, this was not a Milgram study in which we were standing over them telling them what to do. And they began to see the prisoners' behavior as a kind of an affront to their authority, and they began to push back.
We would ramp up the general harassment, just sort of crank it up a bit. Nobody was telling me I shouldn't be doing this. The professor is the authority here. He's the prison warden. He's not stopping me.
This is unbelievable. It took our clothes.
Hands off the door.
There was the first evening a kind of rebellion that took place.
The prisoners rebelled. They barricaded themselves in their cells and said, we refuse to come out. They took off their numbers. They didn't want to be de-individuated. They started cursing the guards to their face. And the key turning point was the guards began to think of them as dangerous prisoners.
So let's focus on some of the details here. Not too many years later, after the shocking experiment, Philip Zimbardo in 1971 and his colleagues at Stanford conducted an experiment to investigate the effects of social roles and environmental conditions on human behavior. 24 male college students were randomly assigned to be either a prisoner or a guard in a simulated prison environment. And the prison was set up in the basement of Stanford Psychology Building, and the participants were told that they would be participating in a 2-week study of prison life. They were told that what their various social roles were, whether prisoner or guard, and after that they were left to their own vices. And keep in mind, the study was supposed to take 2 weeks, but within days of the experiment beginning, the guards began to exhibit sadistic and abusive behaviors towards the prisoners. The prisoners, in turn, became depressed and showed signs of extreme stress. Due to this, the experiment was actually terminated at 6 days after it started, due to concerns about the ethical implications of the research. Now, some takeaways from the study. We learned social roles and environmental conditions can have a powerful influence on human behavior. People have the potential to lose their individual identity in specific situations and act in ways that are not, quote unquote, typical to who they identify as. People are also more likely to conform to the expectations of their social roles, even if those roles are in conflict with their own personal values. Furthermore, people are more likely to engage in abusive or harmful behavior when they are in positions of power or authority. And there's also a Netflix movie by this same title for those of you who are interested in seeing more about the Stanford prison experiment. So that wraps up our section on obedience. Tune into part 4, tune into the next part as we have the discussion and finish the conversation of social fluence as it impacts groups.